네, 제9회 아시아 미래 포럼 기조 세션 들어가도록 하겠습니다. 오전 기조 강연은 토마 피케티 프랑스 파리 경제대학교 경제학 교수님, 그리고 리처드 윌킨슨 영국 노팅엄 대학교 사회역학 명예교수님께서 함께 하시겠습니다. 우선 첫 번째 기조 강연의 주제는 불평등 그 현재와 미래입니다. 첫 번째 기조 강연해 주실 토마 피케티 프랑스 파리 경제대학교 경제학 교수님을 무대로 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.
Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me. Thanks a lot for your attention. Let me first apologize for the fact that my English may sound a lot like French, and so I hope for those of you who know French, this may be something good. But well, I hope you can still understand what I have to say. So. Today, I'm very honored to give this introductory speech. What I'm going to do, essentially, in this presentation is I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to show you a number of results coming from the World Inequality Report, which you can find online very easily. And so if you want to know more about the report, just go on this website. So I'm going to start showing you some results from this report, where we now, in the World Inequality database that we use in this report, we now cover more and more countries, including Korea, which I should say was not included in my book, largely because of limitation in data access, which I would like to be able to access more data on inequality in Korea and in many other countries. And the second thing I will do in this presentation is to show you some new research results trying to open the black box of the politics of inequality and trying to understand why, in spite of rising inequality, we have not seen so far the kind of political response to rising inequalities that you could expect to see, in particular in Western countries. And I will show results on the long-run evolution of political cleavage with regard to inequality in the US, in Britain, and in France, which provides possibly some explanation as to why we have a limited political response to inequality so far. And in particular, I will show you some series documenting a shift from what can be described as a class-based political conflict in the post-World War II period to a structure of political conflict today that can be described as I will explain later, multiple elite-based political conflict, which can maybe be part of the explanation as to why we don't see the political response that you could see to rising inequality. And of course, then the next question is why do we have such a transformation of political cleavages? And I will stress three factors. Certainly rise of globalization, and in particular the migration cleavage, has created a new tension within the electorate in Europe, also in the US, in the particular US racial context. But I will argue that the rise of higher education has been probably an even more important factor. So here the idea is that as long as you are in the era of primary and secondary education, there's a very simple egalitarian platform, which is simply, well, you want to get everybody, 100% of a generation at the top of primary school and then at the top of secondary school. With higher education, it's more complicated because you cannot have, as a policy platform, the objective of getting 100% of a generation right to the PhD, or at least not in the foreseeable future. So you have to design a policy platform that sort of tolerates some level of persistent educational stratification, and at the same time helps the more disadvantaged group, at least as much as those who have already succeeded in higher education. And I think this has been a major challenge for what used to be left-wing parties in the post-World War II era, and I would argue this is, in the end, what have made them being sort of less and less appealing to the socially disadvantaged electorate. And finally, change in global ideology, especially following the fall of communism, I think has been an even more important factor, and is also probably the most important factor for the future, which also means that new change in global ideology can also make a difference. So let me start right away with some results from the World Inequality Report. So I don't know, I hope this is a sort of readable from the room. So here you have one simple indicator of inequality, which is the share of total income going to the top 10%. So it's a very simple indicator. I think it's more intuitive than the Gini coefficient or other index that sometimes are used in official reports, which are a bit abstract to understand. Here, I think it's more intuitive. So this is the share of total income going to the top 10%. So if you had complete equality, it should be 10%, because this is 10% of the population. If you had complete inequality, it should be 100%. So, of course, it will always be in between. But what's striking is that this can actually change quite a lot in between. So, in particular, in a space of a few decades, you can see that this has increased in every country, from around 30% in 1980 to today, 40, 50, 60%. I've not shown you on this graph, but in the World Inequality Report, we also show other areas of the world. You have other regions in the world, like the Middle East, which, according to our estimate, is the most unequal region in the world, where the share going to the top 10% is higher than 60%, is between 60 and 70%. So you have a lot of variation, and I think these are very important to understand in order to understand a large number of political tensions that you see in this region. Now, you have rising inequality within countries, and Korea is also has also gone through that kind of trend. At the same time, in the world economy, you also have a reduction of inequality between countries, with emerging countries going very fast towards the high-income frontier. Now, if we put the two trends together, then we get something like this, which has been called at some point the elephant curve by Branko Milanovic, and I think is a... So here what you have is on the horizontal axis, you put citizens of the world, well, world individuals from the poorest to the richest, and you look at what the total cumulative growth has been here between 1980 and 2016, depending on where you are in the distribution. So what you can see is that at the bottom, you have indeed the rise of emerging countries. So you have quite large growth rate at the bottom of the distribution. This is typically in China and a number of emerging countries. Then in the middle, well, it's more in the upper middle of the distribution, you actually have much less income growth. This has a lot to do with the middle class and lower class in the richest countries, which have seen very limited growth over this period. And then at the top, you have this huge growth coming from the top income in rich countries, but also from the top incomes everywhere in the world. So in the end, you have a quite a complicated shape, which means that there's really two sort of contradictory evolutions that have been going on in the globalized economy in recent decades. You have a reduction of inequality between the bottom and the middle, which is good in itself, but then you have an increase in inequality between the middle and the top. And so if you only try to look at this with a synthetic index like a Gini coefficient, everything will look flat, and you will say, okay, nothing is happening. But except that, in fact, a lot is happening. Okay, inequality has been reduced in the bottom and increased in the top. Now, sometimes, people fight about globalization. Some people say, oh, but, you have reduction of inequality between countries. And some people say, oh, but you have increase of inequality within countries. But in fact, both are true at the same time. So it's stupid to fight. We must first agree on what we have. What we have is that both are true at the same time. And then the objective must be to keep the good part of globalization and try to get rid of the bad part. So the good part is the convergence between the bottom and higher part, and the bad part is increasing inequality at the very top. Now, some people could say, well, we need to have this increase in inequality at the very top in order to have the increase at the bottom. But, then the question is, well, what is the evidence for this, and how far do you want to go? And here you can see that the share of total world growth that have been absorbed by the top 1% in the world has been 27% of total macroeconomic growth over this period, which is more than twice as large than the share of total growth going to the bottom 50%, which is 3.5 billion individuals. So how far do you want to go in this direction? If the share of total growth going to the top 10% was 50%, 80%, would you still say, well, it's worth it for the... At some point, we have to be ready to discuss how far we can tolerate inequality to go. And if you look at the different countries, it's not true that the countries that had the highest increase in inequality also had the highest growth for the bottom. If you look India vis-à-vis China, India had bigger increase in inequality than China and had much lower growth performance. If you look at US versus Europe, you have much bigger increase in inequality in the US, but in fact, the bottom 50% in the US did not benefit at all from this growth. So the claim that we need to have the bottom go as far as possible so as to improve the bottom, it's not as simple as that. So we have to take seriously the idea that there are alternative ways to organize globalization. The issue is not to destroy globalization, but to keep the good part and try to improve what could be improved. Now, in order to learn more about what could be improved, probably the best way to proceed is to look a little bit at history and how inequality evolve in the longer run. So if you take the three big part of the rich countries for which we have long-run evidence, US, Japan, and Europe. Well, this is an average of Western Europe, to be more specific. What you can see is that the increase in inequality that we have in the recent decade, so this is the same increase in the top 10% income shares that I have shown you before. In fact, if you put it in historical perspective, it came after a period of decline in inequality during the first half of the 20th century and a period of stabilization in the post-World War II period. So how did it happen? Why was there this decline in inequality? So, of course, the war that the Prime Minister was referring to a minute ago, the war were important, but it's more than the war. It's not just destruction, and destruction is the only way to reduce inequality. In fact, it was also, even more importantly than the war, it was the constructive change in policy that happened partly due to the war, but also more generally because many people in the US, in Britain, in many parts of the world were fed up with the very high level of inequality that you had in the 19th century and until the early 20th century. And so there was a change in attitude, and then wars played a role as a political catalyst. But I think it's possible to argue that some of this evolution were going on before. So just to take one example of this evolution, so this is a simple history of progressive taxation. So you can see that this is, this is a pretty chaotic history. So it is true that until World War I, you had limited progressive taxation. Japan was a little bit ahead of the other countries in terms of, going to relatively higher top tax rate. Germany to a lesser extent. But then in the US, the federal income tax was created in 1913, but in fact this had nothing to do with the war. It happened to be 1 year before the war. It's just because it was a very complicated political process to amend the federal constitution to be able to create a federal income tax. But I think there are good reasons to believe that this was about to start probably in any case, because it's not as if, World War I had such a huge impact on the US as in European countries. So anyway, we are not going to rewrite history, but the point is that at the end of the day, in the middle of the 20th century, you had a huge increase in progressive taxation. So if you take the US federal income tax between 1930 and 1980, so during half a century, on average, the top income tax rate was 82%. Okay? So sometimes it was 91, sometimes it was 70. If you make the average over half a century, it was 82. And this was only the federal income tax, because you also had the state income tax in New York, Texas. It could be 5, 10% on the top of that. Okay? Now, apparently, this did not destroy American capitalism. You know, otherwise we would have noticed it. And if anything, productivity growth rate were actually higher, in particular between 1950 and 1980, than what they have been since 1980. And probably the reason is because these very high top tax rates were applied to very high levels, typically the equivalent today of more than $1 million in annual income. And my reading of the evidence, is that it's not so useful to pay top managers, 10 million rather than 1, or 50 rather than 10, etc. So, I know it's difficult to have a quiet conversation about taxation because people get excited very fast and it's very difficult, they stop listening. But, at some point, this conversation is not going to go away. It will come back and come back. And I think in the end, if you look today back at the evidence, I think this policy of very high progressivity in the middle of the 20th century and the second third of the 20th century was largely a success. And this is what allowed a big reduction of inequality without a decline in productivity growth. So you can see that US, UK have been leading the way in the middle of the century. In Germany or Japan or France, a big part of the redistribution was done through destruction, through the war. And so indeed, there was less need of progressive taxation. So this is true for the progressive taxation of income. This is also true, so here this is progressive taxation of wealth, inherited wealth. So you can see again, US, UK, but also Japan, going very far in progressive taxation of wealth. Germany and France going less far, partly because a big part of the redistribution in Germany and France was done through destruction, inflation. I tend to prefer progressive taxation. So I think it's not that only war reduces inequality. Most importantly, policy can make a difference. Now, today, I think inheritance taxation and more generally wealth taxation is still a very powerful role to play to reduce inequality of opportunities. So in Korea, I don't remember, but I think the top inheritance tax rate now is like 45 or maybe 50%. I don't know. It was increased in Japan recently. Now it's interesting that in East Asia, if you look at Japan or Korea or Taiwan, actually you have pretty substantial taxation of inherited wealth. Whereas if you go to communist China, you have zero tax on inherited wealth. So if you want to die and transmit your wealth without any tax, you should go to communist China, not to capitalist Korea or Japan. So maybe Donald Trump, if he wants to transmit his wealth with no tax, should go and die in China, which is a bit ironical. And I don't know how long it will take, for China to realize that if you want to fight inequality, if you want to fight corruption, I think progressive taxation is useful. You cannot just put in jail a couple of people from time to time. I think progressive taxation is a very powerful tool. In China, there is a progressive income tax, but it's impossible to have any data about it. Nobody knows how many people pay it, in what province, how this changes over time. I'm not sure this is the right way to fight corruption and to have more transparency about inequality. So I think these are important issues, including, of course, in East Asia. Now, progressive taxation is important, but of course, this is not the only policy that matters. In particular, what's very striking in the evolution of inequality in a country like the US in recent decades is the complete collapse in bottom income. So you can see the share of the bottom 50% in the US distribution of income has gone from 20 to 10%, whereas the share going to the top one has basically done the reverse. Okay, so this is pretty spectacular. Now, progressive taxation is not going to be the only explanation. If you want to explain the collapse of the bottom incomes, you want to look at many other dimensions of policy, including the labor market, including health policy. You know, if you're not in good health, you know, it's not easy to have a good paying job. Minimum wage, you know, you have a complete fall in the minimum wage in the US over this period. And access to education, access to high quality education is probably even more important. Now, on this graph, you know, you have how access, so this is access to higher education in the US. This was measured for people who were in university between 2012 and 2014. And you can see, you know, if you compare with their parental income, so you have parental income rank on the horizontal axis, and you have the probability to go to college or university on the vertical axis. So you can see you get almost a straight line. Well, you know, if your parents are very poor, you still have a 20% chance to make it. And if your parents are rich, you only have a 95% chance to make it. So it's not, you know, it's not exactly the first diagonal, but it's very close to it. And of course, real inequality in access to education is even more extreme because when you are at the top and go to the university, you go to much better universities than when you are at the bottom. Okay? So what this shows is that, you know, you have an official discourse about equal opportunity, meritocracy, blah, 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 and then you have the reality, and the reality, you know, is very different from the official discourse. And so this comes from research by my friends Emmanuel Saez, Raj Chetty, who were able to match the income declaration of the parents with the social security number of the students of their children. And I think I didn't have this kind of data when I wrote my book, Capital in the 21st Century, but I think it's very important that we have more transparency, not only on inequality of income and wealth, but also on inequality in access to public services and education. And, you know, I think maybe one day when we discuss about how to tackle inequality in Korea or in other countries, you know, we will have this kind of target in order to check what has been done and what has not been done. And, you know, I think, you know, we talk a lot about education, etc., but we don't have clear data so as to measure how much has been done, how much has not been done. And I think it's very important, you know, not just to talk about this, but to be able to check, to measure. So is this our objective? Do we believe we can do better than this? If we believe we can do better than this, what is the target? Are we going to be able to monitor the progress from year to year? You know, at some point, this will have to enter into the debate. The problem of how you check, how you verify, how you organize a democratic discussion and you know, involvement about fighting inequality. So I think that's very important. Another dimension of policies that I want to mention before entering into the politics of inequality is the evolution of the share of public property in national wealth. So here you have a number of countries where I put so this also comes from the World Inequality Report, so go online if you want to see the full details behind this data. So here what you have is the share of net public wealth in net national wealth. So you can see China used to be 70%. It has stabilized at about 30% since the crisis. So what you should have in mind is that national wealth is about half real estate and housing and half business assets in the corporate sector or used by public administration, roughly. Could be 60-40 or 40-60, depending on the country, but to simplify, let's say half and half. So this 30% of public share for China in national wealth corresponds to the fact that in housing, 90% has been privatized, so you have only maybe 10% of public share, but in the corporate sector, in corporations, it's only 50%, or actually even a bit less than 50% that has been privatized. So 30% is sort of the average between 10 and 50, if you want to have this in mind. Now, in Western countries, you can see that in UK, US, it has actually become negative in recent years. So that's interesting because when I wrote my book in 2014, I already talked about the possibility of negative public wealth, and my only big example of a developed country that had negative public wealth at the time was Italy, which here is not on the graph. So now we have the UK and the US that are negative. So what does it mean negative? Well, it just means that your public debt is bigger than your public assets. So it means that even if you sell all the public buildings, all the public schools to which we send our children, all the public hospitals, you sell everything on the market, that will not be enough to repay your public debt. So, I'm not saying we should do that and sell all these public assets because we would need then to pay rent to the people who own the schools, own the hospital in order to send our children to school, which will be a bit annoying. But in a way, this is already what we are doing with the public debt because, well, we don't see it right now because interest rates are pretty low, but they may not be low forever. And in effect, when it goes through public debt and the financial intermediation system, it's a bit more abstract, but it's the same. Okay? And so it could be even more negative. So even more negative means that private wealth holders own through their financial claim, they own not only all the public assets there is to own, but also they have an extra residual claim on taxpayer money, basically, for the future. So it can be much more negative. Now, this is largely the consequence of the fact that there's been a lot of tax cut on the very wealthy and creating budget deficit, creating public debt. At the same time, you've had privatization, sometimes at very cheap prices for those who could buy the public assets. So if you have an increase in public debt and a decline in public assets, then of course you have a decline in net public wealth. Now, I don't know what's the optimal level of public wealth. But all I'm saying is that, negative is really very small, okay? So we have to, that's part of the evolution of policy, and that's also related to the construction of a tax system that is perceived as equitable, because I think the fact that a big section of the public opinion now feels that the very wealthy don't pay the tax they should pay, at the end, has a very negative impact on people's willingness to pay tax. People in the middle feel, okay, if people at the top pay less than I do, why should I pay? So if nobody pays, you just push the tax burden onto the public debt. But at some point, you are being owned by someone. We are not being owned by the Mars planet. This all belongs to private wealth holders, and this is just pushing the political conflict further over time. Now, let me take the next 14 minutes to move to the political side of the problem and why is it yet that we don't have the kind of political reaction that we should have? And so here I'm going to focus particularly on three Western democracies, which are the US, UK, and France. So sorry for shifting here the attention to these three countries, but I think this can also be of interest for the political discussion in Asia. Although of course I don't claim that the same conclusion would apply here, and maybe we can discuss this more in the panel discussion. So why is it that rising inequality is not leading to rising demand for redistribution? One very common explanation is that globalization and competition between countries and the rise of tax havens has made it more difficult to organize vertical redistribution. And indeed, if you assume that vertical redistribution between rich and poor has become completely impossible to conduct because anybody with income above average income can put it at no cost in tax haven and pay no tax, which I don't think is the case right now. I think tax havens are not so complicated to fight, but let's assume that for some ideological reason we have constructed ourselves a view of the world where we cannot do anything because it's just, Switzerland is too powerful, Jersey is too powerful, we cannot do anything. Then indeed, if vertical redistribution is completely impossible to organize, and if the only thing government can do is to do border control, well, the political fight will be entirely about border control, and in particular will be about who enters the country, who cannot enter the country, and issues of migration and identity politics are going to become key. And this is largely what has happened, I think, in the US, in Europe, and to some extent in some other countries as well. if I think of India in a different way. I think the story that vertical redistribution has become impossible has far-reaching consequences on the structure of the political process. So now I think that's an important part of what has been going on, but this is largely due to an ideological construction more than a technical impossibility. And I think there are also other reasons explaining this evolution. So what I'm going to show you now is, my point is that in order to analyze the future of redistribution, we first need to better understand the changing multidimensional structure of political and ideological conflict about inequality. So here I'm going to show you some results from a paper where in this research I try to document how the structure of political conflict has changed over time. So let me start with the cleavage by education. So this is a graph, this is for France, and then I will show you US, Britain going very much in the same way. So what do we have here? Here we have the structure of the vote for what used to be called left-wing party. I mean, part of the conclusion of my analysis is that the left-right political conflict of the post-war era has completely collapsed and today has little to do with its original meaning. But here I'm looking at the evolution of the vote for, in the French context, the Socialist Party, Communist Party, and Green Party over this period of time. And this is the difference between the percentage voting for these parties among university graduates and the percentage voting for these parties among non-university graduates. So when it's negative, it means that university graduates vote more for right-wing parties, which was the case in the 50s, 60s. And now it has become positive, which means that today it's the opposite. The university graduates vote more for what used to be the left-wing party. So you have a complete reversal of the education cleavage. So if you want the Socialist Party in France, used to be a party of workers. It has become party of university graduates. Okay? Now this is exactly the same in the US. So this is for the Democratic Party in the US. Now, it's very striking to see how close this is because, as you know, the two-party systems have completely different historical origin. The Democratic Party in the US is not a socialist party. Historically, it was the party of slavery, which then became the party of the New Deal, which then became the party today more of the intellectual elite and the minority. So complete transformation over time in the structure of the party. Whereas in France, we are talking of Socialist Communist Party, which split after the Bolshevik Revolution over the issue of the Soviet Union. So, completely different historical origin, but in the end, very, very close evolution in both cases. Now, let's look at the Labour Party in Britain. So this is the Labour Party in Britain. I actually prefer, so here this is university graduate minus non-university graduate. I actually prefer this graph, which I think is the most meaningful one, where I compare for each year the top 10% in education with the bottom 90% in education. And it would be the same if I would do the top 50 versus the bottom 50. So it's more meaningful because over time, the fraction of people with university education, of course, has increased a lot. But the whole point is that you have this educational expansion, and at the same time that you have this educational expansion, you have a complete reversal of the education gradient. So if you go back to the 50s, 60s, of course, most people did not have university education, had primary education, sometimes secondary. Now, when you were primary, you will vote for the Labour Party or for the Democratic Party or for the Socialist Party in France, more than if you are university. Now, half a century later, most people had their parents or grandparents with no university education coming from primary education. Now, some of them have moved to higher education. Some of them have moved only to secondary. Some of them have stayed in primary. Now, what's striking is that at the end of the period, it's really those who have moved to higher education who keep voting for the same parties, but those who have stayed behind, they don't. So why is it that they don't? I think to me, the main explanation is that the rise of higher education has also come with a transformation in the structure of cleavage such that in the end, the people who have stayed at the bottom of the education distribution sometimes feel that they are not really being considered, by those at the top, that they are being looked on a little bit. And I think, indeed, some of the new educated group in societies have developed an ideology of merit about making it to higher education, making it to Harvard in some cases, or just to higher education in general. And they have developed the view a little bit like the traditional business elite, that, they have made it through their own effort, etc. And those who have not made it, well, we are not going to pay too much tax for them, or we're not going to help them that much, because in the end they should work more, they should put more effort. So I think this is part of the explanation of what has been going on. The other explanation that you see sometimes, which I discuss in this research, is, well, you have the rise of migration cleavage, or, after the civil rights movement in the US, after the 60s, you have all the, big part of the poor white electorate, particularly in the South, who gradually moved to the Republican Party because they just don't like the civil rights movement, and because basically they don't like the African American, okay? And in Europe, the equivalent will be, well, a big part of the white lower class, leave the left parties because they don't like the migrants. So in a way, this other explanation will be, well, it's their fault in a way. We have done everything we could. We do the best possible policy to help them, but, they are racist, so what can we do, basically? Now, I think it's a bit too simple, and I think you can see that the evolution actually starts everywhere much before the migration cleavage becomes very important. So in particular, in the 60s, 70s, it is not true that the migration cleavage is very important in France or Britain, and still you have the same long-run evolution as the US. So I think it questions us about what's really going on. Now, this is for the education cleavage. Now, if we look at so here, this is for France, comparing the evolution of the education cleavage with the income and wealth cleavage. So you can see, so of course, income, wealth, and education are correlated, but they are never perfectly correlated. Okay, you always have some people who have high education but low family wealth, some people who have low education, high family wealth. It's never completely correlated. And income, well, income is complicated, because income is sort of is a product of wealth and a product of education. So it's not surprising that it's intermediate. Now, as you can see, initially in the 50s, 60s, the structure of political conflict was a sort of class-based, in the sense that in any dimension, whether you have a low education, low wealth, low income, the lower groups will vote for the same party or coalition of parties. Whereas today, you have this, what I describe as a multiple elite cleavage, where the high education elite has moved to what used to be the left or the Democratic Party in the US, whereas the high wealth and high income party are still voting for the right, although less and less so. So one possibility is that, in fact, all the elite, in the long run, you could say, well, the high education elite will control everything, and they will control the wealth, they will control everything, so they will all vote together. That's a possibility. That's a little bit what we see in the US in 2016. So in the US, so here I have put a dashed line for 2016, both for France, because it was also a very special election in 2017, and in the US 2016, of course, Trump, so the 2016 election, for the very first time, the top income vote Democrat, and not only the top education vote Democrat. So here you have both the high income elite, high education elite that go to Democrat in 2016. Now, you could say, well, it's just because Trump is so crazy that, even the very high income, or, they don't want to vote for him. And maybe if the Republican Party comes with a more reasonable candidate in the future, the high-income elite will return to the Republican Party. We don't know. It's a very open question. But it could be, there's a possibility of a complete reversal in the structure of the political cleavage. It really depends also on what political parties do. And this is where I would like to conclude, is that, this is not a passive game where political actors or journalists or media or, people, cannot do anything. I think there are different possible evolutions. If you look at the case of Britain, you can see Britain in 2016, in fact, there is an increase in the separation between the high income and the high education. So you can see in 2016-17, the high education voting for the Labour Party, but the high income and high wealth, they don't like Corbyn at all. So maybe they don't like Brexit too much either, but they hate Corbyn even more than they hate Brexit, and so they go for conservative in 2017. What this shows is that different party strategy matter. And if it had been Bernie Sanders instead of Hillary Clinton in the US, maybe we would not have had this. We would have had a very different curve. So, okay, my point here is not that I can predict the evolution of this structure of political cleavage. That would be stupid. My point is that we used to think of politics as a world where you have the sort of left defending the poor, right defending the rich. I think this is a very naive view. This has always been a very naive view of politics, because politics has always been about a multidimensional conflict on inequality. You have inequality of what? Are we talking of inequality of education, inequality of income, inequality of wealth? You also have gender inequality, inequality in origins, migration trajectories, racial, etc. So in a way, it's a miracle that we can have a political coalition that is able to put all these dimensions of inequality into a consistent platform. And so this is what happened in the 50s, 60s, which is good, but we should think seriously about how this can happen again. But this is nothing natural in this particular organization of political coalition. So to summarize, my main conclusion on the political side, globalization, migration, with the rise of domestic versus external inequality, and also educational expansion with the rise of education versus property inequality, have created new multidimensional conflict about inequality, leading to a complete collapse of the post-war left versus right party system. So why didn't democracy reduce inequality? Well, the simple answer will be, because multidimensional coalition, as I was just explaining, are complicated. And if you don't have a strong egalitarian internationalist platform with coordinating progressive taxation at the regional level, if not global level, to finance better public services for the poor and the middle class, in particular in education. So if you don't have a platform that can convince people that what they have in common is more important than their differences, you should not be surprised if you find that different origins, in particular racism, nativism is a very powerful force to divide the poor. Higher education is also a very powerful force, because people who are not at the top of education feel looked down at them, and I think the left or the progressive side, or whatever you want to name it, has not thought enough about that. The good news, I think, is that social sciences can help, and I hope this little presentation has convinced you that looking at historical evolution on inequality, taxation, education, electoral behavior can help us better understand some of the issues we are going to face in the future. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Professor Piketty, for so eloquently setting the stage for the discussions that we are going to have today and tomorrow. 네, 좋은 강연 감사드립니다. 수고해주신 토마 피케티 교수님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.